For a brief moment in 1942, the United States was not on the offensive, it was on the edge of losing control of the Pacific. American forces were retreating, supply lines were collapsing, and Japanese expansion seemed unstoppable. This was not just a setback. It was a strategic crisis. But how close did this crisis come to becoming a permanent defeat? Japan did not seek total conquest of the United States. Its objective was more calculated and more realistic. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, seize vital resources, and build a defensive perimeter so vast that America would be forced to negotiate. It was a gamble built on timing. But what happens when timing is the only thing holding a strategy together? The attack on Pearl Harbor was tactically successful, but strategically incomplete. Battleships were destroyed, but the U.S. carriers were absent. Even more critical, fuel reserves and repair facilities were left untouched. The foundation of recovery remained intact. Did Japan win the battle, but miss the war? In the weeks that followed, Japan moved with extraordinary speed. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies fell in rapid succession. Each victory expanded Japan's reach and tightened its control over oil and raw materials. Could this momentum become irreversible? In the Philippines, American forces were cut off and overwhelmed. Supply shortages turned defense into survival. By May 1942, resistance ended. It was not just a defeat, it was a warning of how vulnerable U.S. positions had become. If one major stronghold could fall this quickly, what would fall next? Japan's expansion was not random, it followed a precise design. A ring of fortified islands would serve as a shield, stretching American resources thin across thousands of miles. Like extending a net across the ocean, the goal was to make any counterattack slow, costly, and uncertain. But how strong is a defense that depends on distance alone? At the center of this strategy stood Midway. Capturing it would extend Japan's reach deeper into the Pacific, and potentially eliminate the last operational U.S. carriers. Without them, American naval power would be severely crippled. Was Midway the final step in securing Japanese dominance? While Japan prepared its offensive, American codebreakers were already reading key elements of its plans. This was not luck, it was methodical intelligence work. For the first time, the United States could anticipate, rather than react. Can knowledge outweigh numerical disadvantage? U.S. carriers moved into position northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. It was a calculated risk. If discovered too early, they would face overwhelming force. If timed correctly, they could strike at the heart of Japan's fleet. How much does victory depend on being seen, or staying unseen? As Japanese aircraft returned from initial strikes, decks were crowded, weapons were being reloaded, and command decisions were still in motion. In that moment of transition, the fleet was at its most vulnerable. What happens when precision meets perfect timing? American dive bombers arrived unexpectedly. Within minutes, multiple Japanese carriers were set ablaze. Fires spread rapidly. Control was lost. What had been a powerful strike force was suddenly collapsing. Could such a short moment truly reshape an entire war? Japan did not just lose ships, it lost experienced pilots and trained crews. These were not easily replaced. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked the industrial and training capacity to recover quickly. In war, is it the equipment, or the people, that matter most? Back home, American industry surged. Shipyards launched new carriers at an unprecedented pace. Aircraft production expanded rapidly. It was not a single battle, but a continuous buildup of strength. Can production itself become a weapon? The Pacific War was defined by distance. Supplying forces across thousands of miles required coordination on a massive scale. Japan's extended supply lines became increasingly fragile, while the United States adapted and improved its reach. In a war of oceans, who truly controls the battlefield? After Midway, the balance began to shift. Japan could still fight, but it could no longer dictate the pace of the war. Initiative gradually passed to the United States. How quickly can momentum disappear once it begins to fade? Early 1942 represented Japan's best opportunity. Its forces were advancing, its strategy was intact, and its enemies were unprepared. But that opportunity was brief, and required near-perfect execution. How often in history does success depend on a single fragile window? Japan was never close to invading the United States mainland. But it came close to something else, creating a strategic position strong enough to force negotiation. That outcome depended on speed, coordination, and avoiding critical mistakes. And what happens when even small mistakes carry enormous consequences? Even at the height of its expansion, Japan's position was more fragile than it appeared. Its navy was operating at the limits of its range. Fuel reserves, though newly captured, were not yet secure within a stable supply system. Communication lines stretched across vast distances, increasingly difficult to protect. At the same time, American submarines began targeting Japanese shipping with growing effectiveness. Tankers, cargo vessels, and supply convoys were slowly reduced. Not in dramatic battles, but through persistent, calculated pressure. Why did this matter so much? Because Japan's strategy depended on maintaining strength across its entire perimeter. Every lost ship weakened not just a single position, but the entire structure. In contrast, the United States was learning, adapting, and reorganizing. Command structures improved. Coordination between Navy, air, and intelligence became more precise. What had begun as a defensive struggle was quietly transforming into something else. By late 1942, the nature of the war had begun to change in subtle but decisive ways. Japan was still capable of launching offensives, but each operation carried greater risk and fewer reserves behind it. Losses could no longer be absorbed as they had been in the opening months. Meanwhile, American forces began testing new strategies. Instead of confronting every stronghold, they selected targets carefully, prioritizing positions that would disrupt supply lines and isolate entire regions. It was a methodical approach, designed not for immediate victory, but for long-term advantage. What would this mean over time? It meant that Japan's expansive perimeter, once its greatest strength, was becoming a liability. Each island required protection. Each route required defense. And with every passing month, the distance that once shielded Japan now worked against it. By 1943, the balance of the Pacific War was no longer defined by sudden victories, but by direction. Japan was still fighting, still defending, but no longer shaping the outcome. The initiative had shifted, and with it, the future of the war. American advances were no longer isolated. They were connected, strategic, and continuous. Each operation built on the last, tightening pressure across the Pacific. Airfields were captured. Supply routes were cut. Key positions were bypassed and left to weaken over time. Could this process be stopped? For Japan, reversing this trend would have required not just a victory, but a decisive, war-changing success. Something on the scale of Midway, but in reverse. That moment never came. And as the gap in strength continued to widen, the question was no longer how Japan could win, but how long it could continue to resist. In the end, Japan's early victories demonstrated what was possible, but also what was unsustainable. The United States absorbed the initial shock, adapted, and expanded its strength. The question is not whether Japan nearly defeated the United States. It is whether it ever had enough time to try. Or was the outcome decided the moment the first opportunity slipped away?